anything. Might as well jump right in.
Nice.
Sorry about the mix-up a couple of weeks ago. It's that trip to the East Coast scrambles my Google Calendar, and that's why the Calendly didn't operate properly. But I had sent you a message during the who'd have thought living up in the mountains, you'd be vulnerable to a hurricane, but there you guys were.
In point of fact, not me.
Not you.
Even during the hurricane, even as the rain was pounding, my basic sense was, whatever. Hurricanes don't happen in the mountains. We'll be fine.
Yeah, yeah. But I when I was living in the Dominican Republic, the public employees would often go on strike because they weren't terribly well paid in the developing world. And I remember the meteorologist went on strike once when a tropical storm hit the town I was living in. And we woke up one morning to our bedroom was on the second floor, and there was the floor was covered with water. It wasn't that the flooding got up that high, but and then friends of ours who lived in the same time after we left, a hurricane actually hit that town, and they were living in a concrete house, and they decided to ride it out. And as with many people that live on the East Coast, the first time they decide to ride it out is usually the last time if it
Hmm.
hits them dead on,
Mhm.
because I think we live in a degree of pretended stability that we imagine it can't happen to me. And then when it does, everything changes. So I wanted to, well, we can go on to talk about anything, of course, but I really wanted to hear from you about your reflections of living through a disaster now as a Christian. And I don't know if you had lived through any before you were a Christian, but I wanted to sort of listen to your reflections on this, because it isn't just your a recalibration of your own internal sense of vulnerability and humanity. It's also an observation on the collective response of Christians and non-Christians to one's world coming undone. Partly because, in my experience, one of the greatest provocations of either conversion or deconversion tends to be that experience of one's world coming undone, not only individually, but collectively. So that's why I wanted to talk to you.
Nice. So, obviously a lot. Let's see. So I just ever so lightly did have. I was in Southern California during a few different periods where the fires were big, big enough that everybody had to evacuate. So an experience of having to leave, and it was in, qualitatively different in the very distinct sense that the primary response was just leave. So we just sort of there was no notion or even realistic possibility of any coming together to help because it's just a fire, right? It's not community support is not. I don't know actually. Now that I think about it, maybe that is a thing that happens, but it certainly didn't happen in our context. Um, where in this context, it wasn't until there were flood warnings and there were very micro evacuation orders, but everybody was surprised by the magnitude of what happened. There was not, I don't think any, I've talked to a number of different groups that were sort of fire departments or emergency response, and there was no corporate sense that this was going to be anything like this. The rain, trees, maybe flooding, but the magnitude of what happened was substantially higher than anybody expected. And as I'm sure you know, those kinds of things tend to step function.
Yep.
Right? So it's not. So we went through like two or three step functions outside of the boundary of what people expected, and it took a good solid 3 days for that fact to land. And just kind of set the scene as the somewhere in the morning, maybe about 6 or 7 in the morning, as the destruction starts to really land. Both the flooding, whether we had tornadoes, high wind, rain, landslides, and different kinds of flooding. You have sort of the we might call like surge flooding, water levels rising and flooding things, and then we had flash flooding, like strong water just tearing through stuff. So all those different elements combining, you end up with a situation where there's no power, there's no internet, or cell phones. So all telecommunications is cut off. Um, a very large number of roads are washed out. Some are still gone, and no water. Okay, so that's so you're suddenly there. And I mean, my experience, the experience I think that I've talked to a bunch of people, it seemed to be generally the case was that for about 60 hours or so, there was a sense of um, being in the world that we were in, but not as pleasantly. And then an increasingly dawning awareness that no, in fact, we're not in that world anymore. And we're in some other new place, and it's not quite clear what that place is going to be like. Um, and it's interesting because I actually do remember there was how do you call it, like a pivot point, a decision point where there's a lot of tension. Food, for example, is now beginning to go away. People are running out of food. People are running out of water because there's no water, and any water that you might get from a river was definitely not vaguely drinkable. And no sense of when water might come back, by the way. So you have both the practical reality that water's not there and the deeper concern of, wait, this might be a wow, which as it turns out, it was. We just got water back yesterday, um, maybe 2 days ago. And because and gas stations were out too, because for whatever the magnitude of the power turned off the pumps for the gas stations couldn't work. And so one of the interesting characteristics of where we lived was that the road to our east is the major highway, and it was washed out maybe about 3 or 4 miles outside of town. And all the major highways were washed out for the first 4, 5, 6 days, something like that. So we were definitely on an island. And therefore, a lot of people who had headed east trying to get to Charlotte got stopped, turned around, and just basically stopped in the intersection at our town. So we had hundreds of people, strangers, importantly, who either their cars were out of gas or they had nowhere else to go, right? Their houses were flooded or washed out, or whatever, camping, right? So by day two, I ride my bike around town to find out what's going on. And I notice, oh, wait, there's a lot of people here and nobody knows what's happening. I talked to a bunch of truckers. I talked to a bunch of people. There was one gas station convenience store that was open for about 40 minutes before it just got completely washed out, cash only, of course. And there's like, that might get dodgy, right? Things might not be so awesome in a little while. And then I start hearing some rumors, right? This is another thing, by the way, how communications drops to the oral very quickly. And of course, in the oral, we have to deal with rumors because people only know what they've heard, but you still need to get information. So rumors about similar situations in Swannanoa, which is, everybody tells me, much worse situation. Like Swannanoa got substantially more heavily hit than Black Mountain. Black Mountain got hit, Swannanoa got devastated. And so the same thing, like the big grocery store there, people are gathering, it's getting a little bit, So, in fact, by the way, but as you get to the end of day three, the guns come out. You start seeing the open carry laws are being highly used, like a large fraction of people walking around with guns. And, I had my gun out, like in the house when I went to sleep, the gun was loaded and ready to go. Many of my neighbors did too. So that was like a sense like, okay, we don't quite know what's going to happen, but if it goes, it might go this way with enough to make choices, like actions on that basis. And as it turns out, so Friday, Saturday, we're now Sunday, right? So day three, Sunday. And so we have the opportunity to go to church. And as it turns out, the road was just quite cleared enough that we could get there from where we lived. And I'm not sure what fraction of our church was able to make it. Still, many, many people were stuck in their houses, but a meaningful amount. And we were certainly committed to worship. And maybe as it turns out, one of the members of the congregation had been doing crisis response as missionary work for decades. And so he says, hey, this is what's going to happen, and this is what we're going to do. And so, like a 180-degree pivot. There was no more any question of how do we kind of like fall back in response to what's happening to us. It's how do we step forward into how we're going to respond to what's happening. And then it was a decisive change. Like we exited the old world. Now we're entering a new world with we're still interested in, is the power going to be off? Is the water going to be on? Like what's happening? How do you communicate? What's going on? Starlink starts showing up, things like that. But now it's a very different sensibility because there is an actual corporate response. by our church. And of course, interestingly enough, given the fact, obviously it was Sunday, many other churches also spontaneously respond the same way. I mean, on the order of probably 20 or 30 within the 10-minute circle around my house, maybe more, um, and begin to go. And at exactly the same time, people from outside start to show up. Oftentimes, no particular planning. There's a personality type who just something happened and they just felt they needed to help. And so they just rented a U-Haul truck, stopped off at Walmart and started driving. And 12 hours later, making their way through roads that are out, they show up. And for some reason, they show up at our church. And so, okay, great. What do you got? Unload, go. And so, yeah, a solid 2.5, almost 3 week sprint of craziness, all kinds of craziness going on. Um, it was profound, very beautiful, and also very tragic because these things naturally go together. And it was a different kind of world. And it was interesting for me to observe what it took for us to move into this new kind of world, given the characteristics, and how things changed, by the way, when, for example, for whatever reason, Verizon turns back on, and people with Verizon phones suddenly have some meaningful access to the internet, but everybody else's phones are off. And what that does, it was, everything was interesting. The first time that we finally were able to drive an hour because we'd heard that gas was available out more in that direction, and began to see more. Like, oh my gosh, we don't actually just live in this 10-minute circle. We live in this much larger place. Oh wow, and that place is destroyed, and that grocery store is just open and just working. What's happening here? So, I mean, there's a lot, but that's just maybe a brush of the scene.
Well, to me, I mean, the word apocalyptic, which of course is this deeply important word throughout the Bible. The day of the Lord in the Old Testament is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is Noah's flood. It's the plagues, wonders upon Egypt. It's the Dead Sea crossing. It's the Jordan crossing. It's the coming of smoke and fire to the tabernacle and the temple. It's the Babylonian destruction of the temple. It's the destruction of the Babylonian Empire by the Medes and the Persians. It's the Christmas story. Advent is all about apocalypse. It's the crucifixion. It's the resurrection. It's the day that the Apostle Paul is looking at. It's the day when the police show up at your door when your husband is late and you go into shock even before they say, "Are you so and so? I've got bad news for you." It's the day when the doctor sits down and says, "These symptoms that you're experiencing are part of a pattern, and I suspect," and then you don't hear anymore. It's but when so the day of the Lord comes, it fractals. It's global. It's, when in my conversation with Peugeot and Vervaeke, when we were talking about the sacred, I thought Jonathan nicely located the day of the Lord in Auschwitz and the day of the Lord at Hiroshima, and this looming day of the Lord in the way that the revelation of the atomic bomb to the world changed human psychology and human culture immediately. 2016, the election of Donald Trump was the day of the Lord. COVID was the day of the Lord. And, to me, when I listen to you talk, it's the revelation of deep code. It's when the guns come out, revelation has happened. And when you go to, and when this is the week that this is the week when you get to church and you look around, that some couldn't make it, but you look around and we are it. We are the church. And there is deep code within us that we didn't even know was there, and it started operating. And all of these things begin to happen. And so, I mean, that's exactly why, I mean, one of the things that I've seen from you is a capacity to speak of deep code, because the truth is most of our code is unrecognizable to us and non-discernible until something happens and the world around, we begin to understand that we live in multiple worlds simultaneously. And what happens in Apocalyptic is that one world is peeled away and another world emerges. And whatever world you inhabit from that point on is not the same as the world you thought you were living in before.
Hmm.
So what did you see in yourself in terms of your deep code? And what did you see in the church?
Hmm. Okay, so for example, I woke up in the middle of the night and the names of people who I cared about that I didn't know how they were doing were running through my head.
Yeah.
And so I started writing them down and endeavoring to find out. And noticing, by the way, that some of them were people who were far enough away that absent a change in the state, the circumstances we were in, I wasn't going to be able to find out. But there was a couple of layers. One layer was, okay, I need to know that my people are well. That's one thing that was very clear. Actually quite significant. I get on my bike. I actually went walking around town, somewhat, let's say stupidly, because this could have been fatal, but I was walking around during the middle, like as the hurricane was at its peak. Right. So we're talking 5, 6, 7 in the morning. As soon as light comes up, I just start walking, and I actually end up walking a square where the boundaries of the square, or three sides, are where the come turn. Oh, we back.
We're back.
Um, Go to what I was thinking was going to be the highway, but it turns out the highway is now completely flooded. Turn, walk to, oh, there's another major flood. Okay, we're actually in this very small square. For the period of the hurricane, we're actually in a square that I could walk the entire space of it, and that was the world. Well, why was I doing that? I had a sense of a need and a responsibility of understanding what was going on, and then actually reporting that back to other people so we could begin, right? So a sense of, in myself, let's say a native sense of feeling of responsibility for the well-being of whatever this group, larger group of people, not just my family, but the community that I was in. And then I wake up, okay, what about all the people in my church? Where are they? How are they doing? How do we begin to help them? Like, actually, what are the actions that we can take? And moving into that. And of course, the beauty of it was that I wasn't alone in that many of the other people in the church had exactly the same sense. And I was able to cross off names. Okay, we know they're okay. We know they're not, we know they're not okay, but we know where they are and how to help them. We don't know anything about them, circle, and we can't do anything about that. Okay, let's check in, things like that. Um, in the context of the church, I would say that there's two tones, like two major tones. One tone is the people who I know or live near. So these are members of the church who are also part of my community. Let's just make that distinction. Um, and I guess I always knew it because that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to it. But it was beautiful to watch it happen, which was a profound, immediate orientation towards sacrificial love, let's say. And it was real. Like, people put significant their lives on pause, their jobs on pause, in many cases their families on pause, and began to work and putting a lot of effort into work. And by the way, in some cases had meaningful risk, physical and certainly emotional. We had a lot of bad experiences that people had, and they just lived with it and dealt with it, and that also sense of helping. And that was real and incredibly beautiful, and also maybe at a slightly less profound tone, but very interesting, was also the orientation towards vocation, meaning we're in chaos. We don't have any particular rules, regulations, how things operate. So everybody start picking things up. Oh, you are really, really good at operating a chainsaw. Then I should probably just give you this chainsaw. You do the chainsaw work. I'll do the next thing, right? You just keep, and it's whatever's in front of you and whatever you're good at. You just keep working on it until eventually something starts to happen and it lands. The beauty. Okay, so the third tone. Um, the church doesn't all live in Black Mountain. And boy, did they show up. I mean, we had the helicopter guys. Suddenly, helicopter people in helicopters are flying and landing in fields, that I can walk to. And who the heck are these people? And they come up and they're from a church in fill in the blank. And they're here. And there's an immediate, yep. Like we're clearly on there, we're on a team and there's a nature that there's something about that team. And one of the primary rules of that team is that you help people. Okay. At whatever risk to yourself. And there was these guys put in some serious risk. Like they were uh, flying helicopters in places they didn't know, two places they didn't know for 16, 12, hours a day. It was just in some sense brutal and also exactly why God put them on earth.
Yep. Yep.
You got the guys coming up from who do we have? I mean, we had Texas, we had Indiana, we had Tennessee, we had South Carolina, we had Georgia, and sometimes they'd come up as one or two, sometimes they'd come up as a group. And of course, I have a little bit of a selection bias because I'm at a church, right? So most of the people who came to our church were churchly people. But still, the potency here is significant. Louisiana showed up in force. And we had a crew of four who drove up from Monroe, Louisiana, and with a food truck, and they just set up next to our church. We spun up some generators, and they cooked meals for the entire community for like 10 days. And then when they left, they let somebody else take their truck and cook meals for another 5 days. I mean, it's just exactly right. And all of it was very much how do you say it right? A joyful ability to actually realize the story that everyone ultimately desires to be in. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so then you said something that I thought I was thinking about this because you used the word deep cut, and I'm not sure it's always the case, but I would say oftentimes it is the case that there's actually more appealing, so let's make it as fear. We actually tend to migrate for whatever reason, by the way, to the most superficial world. You think about like just when you're driving.
Yep.
The more
Yep.
you drive a route, the more you're not in the moment of the driving, but in increasingly you're just like listening to music or thinking about whatever's going on. And then a car pulls out like in front of you and all of that collapses. And then you're in the reality of the fact that you're driving a 4,000 pound vehicle, 70 miles an hour. Like the reality of the heaviness of, oh, wow. Same thing. So the more superficial world evaporates by necessity because the more fundamental is in fact just more fundamental. And you begin to occupy the more fundamental world, and then you start stitching together the pieces that need to be brought together so that it is whole. I mean, as an example for us, it was by day 4, it was sort of tacitly and maybe I guess informally agreed to that everybody, whoever had a pool in their backyard, the pool is now a commons for flush water because you couldn't drink the pool water, but you needed to flush your toilet. And the
Yep.
only way to flush your toilet is you got to carry a big bucket out to the pool. And so now you've got these flotillas of people. Um, by the way, mostly old ladies in my neighborhood, um, usually pulling wagons and 4 or 5 buckets, filling them up, pulling them back. Okay, so that's a part of the functional pieces that you have to put back together. But we're putting it back together from this deeper substrate. For example, a substrate of it's now the commons. We're helping each other. And we're not relying on infrastructure that's in person. We're relying on personal relationships and mutual care to satisfy what are still the basic needs. And so it's like a reboot that has to go down to the bottom, and then all the basic things have to be dealt. The ones that have to be dealt with have to be dealt with, but in this particular way. And then a world is now built from there. And it actually felt that way. I mean, by the time we were 3 weeks in, this is in some sense just reality. Here's how you eat. Here's how you poop. Here's how you get fresh water. And this is what you do. Right? I have to imagine my daughter, who was just about to turn 6 at the time, when you go 2 solid weeks where every day is the same, except Sunday. Um, and in her case, what that meant was after the morning is kind of over, 1 meal a day, more or less, some snacks, but you go to the church and mom and dad sort of get involved in whatever they're doing. And you participate in this whole new kind of feral youth tribe that is doing 1970s kid stuff. Um, by the way, there's a scene. Car traffic is almost gone except for big old trucks. There's a scene where I'm sitting there. I can't remember what I'm doing. I was doing I had a shovel, so I was getting ready to go shovel mud at somebody's house, and I look, and she's 5, almost 6, and she goes zipping by on like an electric motorcycle. I just look, and I'm like, oh, I guess that's what's happening now. And definitely no, not. I don't think she even had shoes. So we're talking 70s, like we're deep, like 72. Um, Yeah. And so that's that notion of there's actually sort of a proper order of the worlds, and that we actually live in the heartbeat of the deepest world, but we ultimately land ourselves or occupy our attention with the most superficial elements. And it's only when something happens that kicks us out of that. And maybe that, yeah, that is the case. That kicks us out of that, that we restore ourselves back closer towards that center. Um, and maybe this is, by the way, now that I'm thinking about it, this is just coming to me real time. This is what the notion of sacraments is about. That the sacraments are these moments that are woven into the nature of reality that allow us to not, in a non-catastrophic way, achieve the day of the Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
And at least, Protestants, sacraments go beyond the two official. I'll say that as a Protestant, because the world is in itself sacramental. But the Protestant churches elevate two, and the two are, interestingly enough, flood and bloodshed. Those are the two sacraments. And the I always try to, in the Christian Reformed Church, baptism is biblically the washing away of our sin, but I always found that overly domesticated, when biblically baptism is a water ordeal. It is, and which is exactly what your community underwent. Your community underwent an ordeal of wind and water. And the sacraments, as we practice them in the church, are ceremonial. They are ceremonial sacraments of the day of the Lord. And we begin our life in a sack of water. And in many ways, birth is sort of a baptism, because we come out of the water and we gasp, you know, air for the first time. And of course, when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, most of the people that I worked with were former Baptists, and so they were not going to have anything about this sprinkling. And when we would, at least in the area of the country that I went to, the missionaries, it was interesting watching the missionaries wrestle with this in different ways depending on the missionary. But the place of the country that I went to, where many of the Haitians were freshest from the other world, they would line up to go into the water, and they were usually dressed in white, and then the preacher would take them and put them under, and in many cases they would start to convulse, because this is an exorcism ordeal. And then the pastor would grab them again and put them under again, and as long as they were convulsing, the pastor would grab them, and you've got to drown the devil out of this person. And then finally the person would just lie in repose, and then the pastor would gather them and bring them back to the world. And I remember some missionaries wouldn't tolerate this, and they would wade into the water and make the pastor or the people stop. It's cut out this nonsense. Other missionaries were sort of, no, don't intervene too quickly. Watch and learn, try to figure out what's happening. And I remember the president of the national church coming out to our region once. And of course, when someone as exalted as the president of the national church comes, you save up your baptisms and you do them when he's there. And I remember the president watching this and saying, our baptisms in the Capitol don't look like this. And but it's but again, it's revelation, it's apocalypse. Well, one of the things that occurs to me too is, now we've had, I regularly avoid political conversation, but the safest time to talk about politics, and the best time to talk about politics, is after an apocalyptic event. And it strikes me that in 2016, I mean, I remembered Aaron Sorkin's letter to his daughter after Donald Trump was first elected. And basically, the heart of the letter, he's saying, we were unable to stop this, but we're not going to let this happen again. And of course, in 2024, it happens again. And if um, if you receive two revelations, you should probably give it even more thought than just the one-off you received. And so, when I think about part of what the apocalyptic nature of a natural disaster is, again, it's so interesting how in our culture, like the Walking Dead, is apocalyptic. It's dystopian, but it's also apocalyptic genre. And especially in our culture, we sort of picked up the dual nature of apocalypse, I think because of the Apocalypse of John, the last book in the Bible, where it's always the day of the Lord is always this revelation, and it is simultaneously a day of loss and trauma and judgment and devastation and death, as well as a day of rebirth and life and opportunity. And part of what happens, I think, especially in our world, where we are now a few centuries into the nation state, because the nation state today is a very different thing. When we look back on maps and we see words like France or Saxony, the lowlands. I mean, so part of what happens then instinctively through the organs of communication is, okay, where is FEMA? And I remember how Katrina, in some ways, undid the the Bush administration. And for a while, that it's sort of you're the disaster that will live with you for the rest of your life, one way or another, has sort of passed from the national scene and was, over, subsumed by other ones. Reflect on me and then you mention, what is a church then? A church is a signal, and it's something around which everyone gathers. I still have that today sometimes when someone will come and Goodwill was closed, and it's, very inconvenient to leave the donatable items from either their move or their housekeeping. So they drive into the church parking lot knowing absolutely nothing of the church and dump their load in the parking lot and say, "Oh, you're the pastor. Here, give this to someone." And out they go. It's like, well, you didn't want to throw it in the garbage. And so now you've basically offloaded your Goodwill trip to me or your garbage trip to me. Thanks, buddy. But again, you've now lived through something. And so, again, I'd love to hear your reflections on the Trump election, the rise of the nation state. Identity used to be
Oh,
Christian more than American or French or Spanish. Those were, I mean, these national identities are Johnny come latelys.
and they're pretty much over. So the nation state is, can I say just over? It depends on how you'd like to think about that.
Yeah,
Like it's,
yeah, 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 yeah.
the classic, what was the phrase Nietzsche said? Like Buddha was dead for 300 years, but they still showed his shadow in the cave, something like that. Like the nation state is dead, but has not yet fallen all the way. And so there's momentum and inertia that's still embodied in what is a dead edifice. And the question of what is in fact alive, I think, is the most one of the more interesting questions. Let's put it that way, and increasingly present. You know, and by the way, I would say that there are many in many ways 2024 and 2016 are the same,
Yep,
and in many ways they are completely different.
yep,
And so one of the things that happened in 2024 that was important is that it was quite clearly now an unfolding of something that was much larger than a given individual.
yep,
It was ostensibly Trump was elected,
yep,
but at least 7 people were involved in that thing in a way that caused other people to orient towards it, of which
yep,
Elon Musk, of course, is a critical exponent.
Yeah.
And that's important, right?
Yeah.
Because what that means is that we're looking at something that is an unfolding that is happening at a higher and more subtle level than sort of merely a cult of what's that called? Charisma, cult of personality. And this wasn't a Reagan era event. This was something else. And of course, from my point of view, it happens to be, or doesn't happen to be, it is part of this larger unfolding where, for example, the nation state is gone. Okay, let's see. Let me just focus in on just a little bit on FEMA because it's helpful, I think, because it points at something that is difficult. It's important to ultimately grasp. The same thing's true of COVID.
Yep.
So, um, I don't fault FEMA. So first of all, FEMA did not show up in any meaningful way for a long time, and maybe kind of still hasn't. Um, but
At
I
least
think
in terms of the imaginary, because
exactly
the imaginary of FEMA is vital to the imaginary of the nation state.
right. So there's no guys in FEMA jackets bringing food and water. There's no sort of trucks with houses bringing any housing. I am reasonably confident, although I have no idea, that there may be significant checks being written by some accountant employed by FEMA to pay for the amazing deluge or flotilla of big vehicles that were driving down from all over the place. Many of them probably weren't pure volunteer, although a lot of them were. But the ones who weren't pure volunteer were getting paid, and they probably weren't just getting paid by, philanthropy. Okay, so as a check writing organization that's deploying financial resources to sort of vetted structures that don't carry the name FEMA explicitly, quite likely, and let's say almost certainly. And and definitely there's more FEMA stuff going on. Almost all of it in the domain of the legal and the financial, meaning people are filling out paperwork to try to get some amount of FEMA funding to rebuild their house, rebuild their business, fill in the blank. Or, by the way, sell their land. FEMA will just buy the land and remove it from the marketplace and just turn it into dead land because flooding is just going to happen there.
Yep.
Okay, so what that means is, so the imaginary of FEMA, the key thing is that FEMA could never have done the thing that was projected upon it because
Yep.
that's not what a bureaucratic institution can do. It's outside of the scope of what is possible under any circumstances by a bureaucratic institution because bureaucratic institutions like the visual image is you think like it's 8-bit, it's coarse grained. It can maybe carry, it could pound, like it can write a $1 billion check. I could do that. And it could kind of hit, and it can apportion that through a tremendous amount of paperwork into capillaries that ultimately reach people. But the idea of getting a human being to carry water up the hill to Michelle's house, that ain't gonna happen.
Yep.
And that's not even it doesn't make any sense that it would happen because I had a hard time getting permission from Michelle to carry water up to her house because I wasn't her kin, right? I
That's
didn't
right.
know her. She's like, "What the fuck are you doing here?" I'm like, "Well," and she's like, literally, she asked, "Are you FEMA?" I'm like, "No, ma'am. I work at I go to the church down in Swananoa Christian." She's like, "All right, well, come on up, and then we'll sit for a while and talk for a while until we have a real sense of who we are and what's happening, and maybe you can get this tree off of my car, right?"
That's right.
Um, that's just not even vaguely in the scope of what a bureaucracy is capable of ever doing.
Yeah.
By the way, bureaucracies are also not the proper instrument to deal with something like COVID.
Yeah.
So this is not just the nation. So you got the nation state as a design space, and then you get a series of implementations of the nation state. You've got the British Victorian version of the nation state. You then have the collapse of that in the face of a variety of different changes, which gives rise to the post-war administrative bureaucratic state. Okay, and we're kind of like we've reached the end of that, and there's this question of do we kind of implement the Chinese technocratic top-down AI state, right? That kind of thing, which is not going to be a nation state anymore, but it'll be a state-like function using technology to do the things that states maybe can do. FYI, bad idea, but that may be something people try to do. And the point being, of course, is that none of them by nature can operate in the domain of relationship, right? They are impersonal by nature. And the human beings who live in them are oftentimes strictly prohibited from operating in the domain of relationship. I mean, you saw the example of the fact that it was actually policy to not go to houses that had Trump flags. And the
Wow.
reason it was policy was because that was categorized as probably too dangerous, hostile territory.
Mm.
In the same category as houses that have really big dogs behind the fence.
Right.
It's like, hey,
Right.
I'm an administrator. I've got a bunch of people who are doing
Right.
stuff. I need to make sure that my people don't get bit by dogs or shot by
Right.
wackos. So I'm just going to apply a rule, and that rule is going to
Right.
just is coarse grained.
It's how
There's a
you
lot of
get it's
false
how you get
positives.
opted out of the postal service. If the postman
Yes, that's right.
believes that your dog is dangerous, suddenly you get a note from the post office that says you can come to the post office to pick up your mail. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yep.
because that notion of intimacy is not part of the structure. The structure is anti-intimate, and everything that is necessarily served by intimacy is therefore completely not served by this kind of a institution, and everything that is best served by intimacy is necessarily poorly served by this kind of institution. Okay, so then what happens is we're entering into a moment, and I experienced this first person. Like we might say that a big part of the transition of this world was moving into the reality that relationships and intimacy are capable of meeting human needs in a particularly profound way. And I mean, I'll just give a simple example. By day four, people are like, we don't have any food. And by the way, in most cases now, we're also troubled by the fact you can't wash your dishes, which means you're piling up dirty dishes. And
Right.
post hurricane, it's all humid and it's all nasty. It's like, this is no good. What are we going to do?
Right.
Um, so the natural answer, all right, we're all going to congregate. Let's all go to one place and we'll have family dinner together. And that's just what you do. And then five or six people, you're getting water out of the pool. Some people are filtering it, boiling it for washing dishes. Other people are beginning to cook food, and that serves 40 or 50 people, which now becomes a completely different sensibility. You begin to realize the why breaking bread together in large groups makes a lot of sense. And that was about 4 or 5 days where we did that, because that's just the context that we had before the food truck showed up and church became the place that we did that. Um, so let's see. Yeah. So part of what we're exiting is the superficial reality where we had given up the sacred, given up the commons, given up the domain where relationality is of the nature and of the essence, into the world of the market and the world of the state, which have capabilities. There's things that they can do, but they are impersonal in nature and anti-intimate in nature. And both of those modes are failing in an accelerating fashion. And one of the biggest opportunities, and again, I say like by necessity, is that we have found a way to, how do you say it? We're either going to enter into the day of the Lord the easy way or the hard way. Let's put it that way. Um, and do so. To enter in the easy way would be a really great idea.
Yeah.
And then B,
Yeah.
hi, let's rest in the fact that the meaning crisis is resolved
Yes.
in the domain of intimacy, in the domain of
Yes.
relationship. And that's something that we need. And if we desperately, like we know we need, we're sort of desiccated. We don't quite understand what it is that we are missing. But we yearn for something that we can't quite put our finger on. But when we begin to experience it, we're like, oh, yes, that, more of that. And we begin to realize that there's a tremendous, actually, wow. I'm going to make a little bit of a shift, but this landed on me heavily over the last week. Oh, that's right, because I actually wrote it to Peugeot. The notion of, in our current moment, we live in a very subtle time. We might say spiritualized time. I'm not quite sure which one is a better way of thinking about it. But the example here is something like Hiroshima and the Holocaust. So the previous moment was a moment of non-subtle, hyper non-subtle, um, intense, objective, loud, noisy, and acute. Right? The Hiroshima lasted for seconds, minutes. The aftermath of cancer lasted for longer, but the intensity of the event was very, very narrow. What we've done is we basically have turned that on the side, and we are now living through a truly chronic and deeply subtle apocalypse. And so, just take for example the notion of what happens to the light, to the meaningfulness of life when people are oriented. The classic example: a family has gone out to dinner and they're not talking to each other; they're on their phones. Very subtle, very, very difficult to grasp the horror of what's happening there. But then if you were able to imagine being on your deathbed and noticing that you actually only spent 6 minutes with the people you loved most, everything else was spent in this extremely superficial trap, actually, then it will land on you potently that your life was basically taken away. You
Yes.
you actually were killed. You were taken into the gas chamber and you were executed, but slowly, very,
Yes.
very, very
Yes.
slowly.
And
And it's a level more
pleasantly.
of the soul.
Yeah.
Yes,
And you're
well,
doing it yourself.
yes, you're made perfectly complicit
Yes.
in this horror, right? And that which is even more insidious. So maybe the word insidious is the best way of putting it. It's subtle, but most fundamentally, it's insidious. And this is a really interesting challenge because while it takes a potent courage to charge the machine gun nests in the realm of the loud and of the coarse-grained and of the acute, it takes a different kind of courage to be able to respond to the reality of the insidious. Um, and so that's part of our revelation. The part of the revelation is, in our case, what happened was all of the distractions just got turned off.
Yep.
We
Yep.
we couldn't participate in any of that, and we were forced to interact with other people.
Yep.
And okay, interesting. And as it turns out, there was something beautiful about that that people are now remembering.
Yep.
Um, but the deeper point, this is what I was trying to say, it's either the easy way or the hard way. As the insidious collapses ultimately, whether it collapses because human beings are no longer able to muster the capacity to produce children, and the species just collapses because there's just not enough people to maintain it, or fill in the blank, right? People actually, something deep inside the darkest elements of the soul revolts so profoundly at the insidious murder that it bursts through and starts, exploding things on the outside. Fill in the blank. There's many different ways it might play out, but the insidious ultimately does collapse.
Yeah.
Um, and that's another thing, right? That's another thing we're facing. And in some sense, we saw that in the context of 2024.
Yep.
Part of what unfolded was a deep, and in many cases, deeply unconscious rejection of nihilism, rejection of death, a rejection of the slow evaporation of meaning.
Oh boy, so many ways I want to take this. It's interesting how the day of the Lord is also an exorcism. And again, I think of the baptism of the Haitians, that their baptism is an exorcism. And what happens with the baptism of the hurricane upon your communities is certain certain spirits are at least temporarily exorcised from all of you. And it's an involuntary exorcism. It's interesting how the world around it sees it as a tragedy, sees it as a catastrophe. But again, it has that dual nature of exorcism is always a death and a rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
Something, and I love how you just framed the insidious. Um, and I wonder now, when I sent you that note, I said, once you sort of get your head out of this, I'm curious now about any sense of nostalgia now that the superficial has reemerged. Now, because this will change you. You won't in some ways participate in the insidious guilt-free anymore because you've been touched by another world.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if I used to have, so I lived for, there's about 7 years that a significantly bipolar, rapid cycling Mormon alcoholic lived against the door of my office. And during those years, I was homeschooling in the morning. And so I shifted all of my work hours to late afternoon and evening. So it'd be in my office every night, and that homeless man would sleep literally against my door, physically against my door. Later, we had this, he had 40 foot of building he could have slept next to. And so I stopped him one day. I said, Daniel, you're always camped against my door. And he looks at me and says, that's so when you come to work, you can see me and we can talk. And I thought, of course it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would I would sit in my office, and this is, of course, before YouTube or anything else. And I'm just a small church pastor in a dying church. annoying my neighbors because of the my seeming inability to resolve the homeless thing that is a mess just one door from them, which is super
Mm.
annoying. And I would just he would just lean against that door, and depending on where he was in his cycle, he would just, I hate my life. I hate my life. He'd just, cuss, cuss. I hate my life. I want to die. I want to die. I want to die. And I'd sit here writing my sermons, listening to him articulate his inner monologue. And then it would be winter, and winter in Sacramento is not a brutal thing by any means. It's not Michigan or Minnesota, but it's cold and it's blowy and it's rainy. It's not freezing, but it can get into the 30s at night. And it was funny because when I was home, warm in bed, with my wife and my children, with a heater on, with locked doors, I had a sense of, and I never understood why I felt this, but I had a sense of, it wasn't quite nostalgia, but it felt like it. Um, it wasn't envy, but it was, I could sense something in his everyday apocalypse that something in me yearned to participate in, but couldn't because I'm the father of a family. And so in that sense, I need to, maintain the doors and keep the family fed and keep the children warm. But there was another part of me, and I think it was tied to the meaning crisis, which, like, sort of in The Walking Dead, I remember at one point in the series, they all begin to realize that all of the survivors are infected with the zombie virus. And the truth is that it doesn't take a zombie bite to turn. All they need to do is die and they will turn. And so suddenly the whole crew now has to, right before people get to or at the moment of death, they have to, they have to do the kill shot to keep their loved ones from becoming a monster. And so I'm curious about what's happening in terms of you emotionally now that the superficial has reemerged and the water is back on and the lights are back on and the internet is back on. And now when you go to church, I imagine there's a layer that things are different because
Mhm.
you've now shared something with these people, and that will never be taken away from you. You will always have a degree of intimacy and memory of moments of intimacy that will go with you for as long as each of you shall live. But I'm curious about if you're having any experience of this, of nostalgia or longing or lament for the day of the Lord and the crisis.
Well, yes, certainly. And even I even recognized that as the life got easier, there was always a bittersweetness. It's actually not that different from being a parent, actually.
Yeah. Yes,
Right?
yes, yes.
Um, when the internet came back on, it was useful to be able to communicate with my mom and my daughters and let them know that I was alive.
Yeah.
And there was a feeling of shit, now I'm going to be doing this thing again.
Yes.
Ah. Um, so that's real. What I think is maybe the most particular, I was noticing like in my mind, like this turning sideways. So Walking Dead is nice because the kill shot, again, it's kind of like it converts our insidious back into the acute. It's like it's like this, but it's this way, not this way. So what does it look like? Well, one of the things it looks like is there was a field of intimacy that came out during the crisis. And then by this, I mean literally the human beings who I began to cultivate relationships with because we were helping each other, which is now no longer present. It's like a constriction of the vascular system. So the smallest capillaries are no longer active, and so those nutrients are no longer reaching that part of the body. I mean, there are people that I was working side by side every day that I haven't seen in 2 weeks. There are people that I was serving, people I was bringing food, water, shelter to that I haven't seen. And so on the one hand, as life has become easy again, and pleasant. I can go to a restaurant, I can get food. It's nice. The 2 days ago, we could actually, or I guess today, I could actually drink with a glass at the restaurant, which was, that's nice. Ice, all these are nice. And also a feeling of, how do you say, like the most marginal, like the relationships that are not as close to the center. They're no longer, in my case, captured by my family, my direct physical neighbors, house church and church, right? Those are the heartbeats that everybody within that sphere is still, it's tight, like it's rich. But there's now people who were within that sphere that are no longer within that sphere.
Hmm.
And and that will continue. Now, interestingly enough, we have Thanksgiving coming up,
Yes.
and we're going to be hosting thousands of meals in the park. It actually was a beautiful kind of secular sacred combo.
Yeah.
There's a Catholic church on this side, there's our church on this side, and then there's a park and a library in the middle, more or less. Like there's not quite exactly adjacent, but within like a 2-minute walk of the place where our church happens to be. And so there was people operating in the secular domain doing good work during the crisis at the park. And then the two churches were doing their thing. And of course, was lots of cross fertilization.
Yep.
And so I discovered at house church last night that we're bringing the band back together.
Yeah.
There's something like literally 500 turkeys that are being brought in, and just getting a massive Thanksgiving feast in this park for everybody, right? Because there's still a lot of everybody who's not in the position to be able to have a thing. And so this is like a way of bringing these relationships back. I'm going to be reaching out to a bunch of people. In some cases, I may have to actually drive out and walk up because they're probably still off the grid. My world got easier, not everybody's did. Um, and say, hey, do you have plans for Thanksgiving? Right? Do you have a place to be where you can be in communion with other people? Um, Sorry, it's fine. I just remembered that my neighbor was decorating for Christmas. I was like, what are you doing decorating for Christmas before Thanksgiving? And she said, well, the thing I'm most thankful for is Jesus. So it made all the sense in the world to me. I go, yeah, okay. Good answer. Put on this Frank Sinatra. Give me some eggnog. Um, but that notion of the real sadness, and by the way, this is a real sadness that I have in general because I'm really terrible at maintaining relationships. So the real sadness of the relationships of care that were outside of that particular sphere that are fading and likely, in fact, just will fade.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
just the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been the Paul King's. Did you see the Paul King's North talk at First Things? Have you had a
I
chance to
did.
look at that? Okay.
I saw his talk and then I actually watched you talk about his talk.
Oh, okay. Well, wonderful. Well, it's Grail Country just did a group conversation on it. I talked to Vesper Stamper yesterday. I talked to John Heers, and part of what's emerging from that for me is this sense of the the rhythm of fasting and feasting that has
Mm,
been in the church for a very long time, and the Orthodox and the Catholics continue to embody it to a degree. And for me, this gets at the nature, the relationship between the day of the Lord, which is, the dramatic, the acute, the thing that cannot be denied.
mhm,
I mean, you could not, there's no sense of riding it out. Unless you're a serious prepper who's living in a bunker and is ready to, tell everyone who's knocking on the steel door, go away, I'm in the middle of Seinfeld. Um, the day of the Lord, in many ways, the rhythm of fasting and feasting season. So even though Americans sort of have it wrong, Advent is a fasting season, Christmas is a season, not just a day, and that's a feasting season. And then you've got
mhm.
Epiphany, and pretty soon you're going to have Lent, which is a fasting season, and then you're going to have Easter, which is a feasting season. And I've been thinking about the fact that because adequately we can't adequately manage, because we are so small. I can think of John Vervaeke's combinatorial explosiveness. The world is just too massive, because we can't both take in the mundane and the apocalyptic, because we have to sort of live in it sequentially. What would happen if even if the highways were never reconstructed and the water never came on again and the power never went on. And of course, in terms of The Walking Dead, that is an experiment in that. So you would all sort of create little systems so that once again the mundane and even this insidious could be afforded to
Yep,
you because you
totally.
cannot live in the apocalypse for very long without sort of becoming a zombie. And that's very much what people become. And when I often look at the homeless shambling around my neighborhood, I often think of zombies because they walk like them and they push carts and they go slow and many of them sort of with the strange combination of hoarding and living and having to contain your all your belongings to one or two shopping carts, you see this sort of continual grooming of the things in your shopping carts in and out and in and out. And so this the church, and when we talked about sacraments, the church has managed to, at a very deep level and without often being able to articulate what we're doing, has managed to embody this fasting and feasting rhythm to try to keep the apocalyptic always close enough to us, I think, in some
Mhm.
ways to sort of keep the code alive within us so that when the day of the Lord comes, it's sort of like, the prepper's closet where the churches keep the sacraments and the fasting and feasting to keep the prepper's
Mm,
closet
mm,
close
mm.
so that, oh yeah,
Nice.
we're going to be, the day of the Lord has come. And now we are going to be sacrificing family time. We are going to be sacrificing marital time. We're going to be sacrificing our wealth. We're going to be sacrificing almost anything. We're going to put ourselves at risk. We wouldn't normally put ourselves at because the day of the Lord has come and I must respond. And, when I think about your story and how it is and why it is you landed where you are, I see the providence of God because I would think of all of the places in North America where, you know, a church scene would touch Jordan's wife's heart, and of course the feminine saying, directing you, Jordan, pay attention to this. Oh, I've been walking by churches all my life, and now suddenly I see something I never saw before. God has brought me through years and so many things to this point where now I see it. And so now I'm settling. And of course, no one on the mountain said, "Oh, by the way, we have hurricanes every 400 or 500 years that devastate us," because nobody has that memory. And so I very much see the hand of God in, and this of course is so, I barely dare to say it because I understand how impossible these words are. The hand of God in the storm, which of course before Lisbon, let's say the devastation of Lisbon that happens in the early modern period, people would regularly say, and it's in the Bible, a plague comes upon Israel, and well, of course, David and his census, that's what did it. I'm not about to say that you brought the hurricane, but the hand of God is, it's something we cannot not talk about, but it's also something we can't talk about.
Well, I can say this. There's a lot. Oh, this is in some sense that if you want to say that I brought the hurricane, which you don't, but just it would
Right.
clearly be the opposite, right? Whatever
Right.
God's doing
Right.
happened to bring me here and a lot of other stuff going on and a hurricane, right?
Yes.
Of which I'm a leaf, right? I'm a leaf blowing in the wind, and there's a whole hurricane. Actually, the hurricanes are a good metaphor. There's
Yeah.
a lot going on here, by the way. There's just a ton. Just off the charts, how much is going on. But here's something in terms of seeing the hand of God. During the context of particularly again after day three, we collectively began to notice that the hand of God was more visible. You could actually see the hand of God, and in some cases, like in almost visually, you would notice and begin to rest on this fact that I couldn't call person X because I don't have a phone. I really need person X right now because person Y has just shown up. Oh, it turns out the person X just came into the room. Okay, great. Once. How about 700 times in a row? Right? How about the person X didn't just come from over here? Person X came from Martha's Vineyard and doesn't know why they're there. And they're in exactly the right moment. Right? This is like the degree to which this starts to become I was at this event with John Heers actually in Florida with Pajot as well about a week ago. And the part of the revelation, moving it from the cognitive to faith, right? Moving the cognitive to the experience and integrated now at a level which is now simply reality for me, is that reality is intrinsically miraculous.
Yes.
The reason why we don't know that is that we don't live in reality. We have exited ourselves out of reality into a fabrication of our own imagination. And whenever the day of the Lord comes, we are restored back to reality to some degree, ideally deeply, at which point it becomes self-evident that reality is intrinsically miraculous because you see it all around you. And it becomes more and more, how would you say, high res.
Mm-hmm.
You could
Mm-hmm.
just you could see it. And you're like,
Mm-hmm.
huh, okay. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, by the way. What are these guys called? The cessationists? I wouldn't be at all surprised. Is that if enough of us restored ourselves to reality for long enough, what would be considered old school, coarse grained miracles would start popping up.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
would not, in fact, I would be surprised if it didn't happen, to be
Yep.
honest.
Well, and to me,
Oh, and this is part of Kingsnorth, by the way.
oh, if you want to say more, go ahead. But I was going to
Maybe.
mention that people in people in the United States continue to wonder why missionaries come back from the developing world with so
Mhm.
many miracle stories, and why every time I hear a new atheist out there saying things like miracles don't happen, I just laugh when I hear that. I just laugh because to me it sounds like the most absurd thing. Because, well, why don't they happen around us? But why do they seem to happen when you're a missionary? Now you're living in a place where you're living with people who have spent significant seasons of their life in different worlds. I mean, John Heers and I were talking about this yesterday, laughing at this together because we both lived in other places, and and when some new atheist comes and I talk about the Haitians, I didn't see it, but the Haitians coming to me and telling me about this heretical and possibly demonic church faction over there that is scamming the people with glass. They're exercising glass emerging out of people's foreheads, and I mean, just crazy stuff. I don't, I don't, I don't doubt that. I'm not skeptical of it. I don't know it for sure, but it's not something that I hear and say, oh, of course that doesn't happen. No, I've seen really weird stuff. And I think, again, it has a lot to do with what we're talking about here, and what you just said in terms of reality is intrinsically miraculous, but we have, I don't think, it's been an evil thing that we've done. I think what you said earlier on that really grabbed me is we migrate to the most superficial world. We just have in our culture and in our time and in our wealth created a level of superficiality that is in many ways unprecedented in human history.
Wildly unprecedented, like orders, 3/4 of magnitude unprecedented in human history. Totally. Um, hmm. Oh, Kingsnorth,
Yes.
if we may. This feels a little abrupt, but it seems like maybe
No, go ahead.
it fits here. So there was the thing that I was just thinking of is that this is part of the story of how Christian and civilization don't fit together. And so part of the story is that the energy of civilization is to civilize, to make ordinary. and to make tractable, manageable, to render the miraculous something that the state can manage, right? To make the state capable of presenting itself as the authority in life, which means it has to digest and push to the margins and to the edges everything that is outside of its natural milieu. Okay, there's a lot more to it, but that's part of it. And obviously, Christ is not that at all, right? Christ is the absolute presence of that, but the point of the presence of that, from a point of view of it being faithful and trustworthy and good and loving and intimate, right? Which is maybe the opposite of the pagan sensibility, right? So if you're dealing with the pagan sensibility and you're dealing with a world of spirit that is filled with all kinds of bad stuff happening all the time, creating a territory of the ordinary that you can control is sort of the point. Right? That
Yep.
is the techne. It is the thing you're trying to do. Um, and that comes as a deal with a different set of devils. Like think about what the Moloch cult is. The Moloch cult is, can I establish something like stability? Can I establish something that is able to feed us and avoid famine? Can I establish something that's able to protect us and avoid being conquered by our neighbors? Can I establish something that prevents us from falling at each other's throats by means of sacrificing our children? Right?
Hmm.
Welcome to the state, my friend. That is the state. The state is a Moloch cult. It can't help it. And the market is a Mammon cult. And those two forces more or less dominate civilization, certainly our contemporary world.
Hang on.
And
Someone is banging at my door, even though they didn't read their text. I'll be right back.
absolutely, if it's that guy, the Mormon guy, that's really interesting. And so, okay, uh, I was just saying, the cult of Mammon, the cult of Moloch, this is very intrinsic to the nature of civilization, variations on the theme. And of course, Christ stands as a complete disruption of that, as both a necessity and a possibility.
Yep.
So, Christian civilization. Now, where Paul, I think, is, I can't tell if he's wrong. Like, I imagine that he would agree with everything I'm about to say, but in the narrow band of a particular presentation, this is a projection that one might make that I think would be an error, and that is kind of the classic retrograde move. Like, oh no, it was really wonderful and beautiful and integrated during the indigenous period of time, pre-civilization, and that if only we could return to living kindly with each other and in communion with nature, everything would be hunky-dory, and Jesus would be like, that's awesome. Like Francis of Assisi would come and sort of settle, the birds would land in our hands, and all would be well. And that's somewhat true. There is something about the indigenous mode of living that is closer to meaningfulness and closer to things that are good and valuable. The notion that you would live with the people and next to the people that you most love is true and good, no question. The notion that because you are deeply in a highly intimate relationship of necessity with your physical environment means that you both be aware of and care for changes to that physical environment is true. You can't be indifferent to it because you can't. That's all true. And we're going to want to get back to that. Right? That's actually a thing that is like a retro futurism. To the degree to which we navigate this thing at all, we're going to want to get back to those things, particularly the human part. But the idea of the fantasy notion that it was all hunky dory back then, and somehow we screwed it up when we started planting corn is wrong. So it's something like the indigenous mode was not an error, but it had a bunch of errors in it. Not the least of which is this problem with disordered spirits running all over the place, and how do you protect yourself against that world, which was of supreme interest to every indigenous group, central interest
Yep.
to every
Yep.
indigenous group. Right? How do you propitiate the spirits is not a trivial question.
Nope.
What do they say? There's no atheists in foxholes. There's no atheists in indigenous land.
Right.
But civilization also isn't an error. Right? There's a lot of it that is off on the wrong track. A lot of it is intrinsically either sin or food for, right, the adversary to play with. But there's something going on. Right? There's something happening where the thing we're headed towards involves more than either. Right? It's not one or, it's more than. And so that's a piece that I would also point out. So it's a beautiful intervention I think he made that helped say, hey, this is not a story where if I could just kind of take Christendom and re-stitch it back onto the nation state, circa Westphalia, things are good. It's also, by the way, not the case that if I could just sort of get rid of the nation state entirely, we all become Iroquois again, things are good. But there's something else. There's something more that we actually need to figure out. And by the way, I would say, can we say this now? It's a lot closer to the Holy Spirit than
Mm.
previous modes.
Yeah. one of the things that strikes me when I've, one of the beauties of being a preaching pastor is you get to, you are forced to revisit the scriptures again and again in a different way, because my John Stott talked about the preaching profession as being stuck between two worlds. You're always trying to deal with this Bible and talk to people at it, on Florin Road in 2024. And I talked to them in 2020, and I talked to them in 2016, and I talked to them in 2000, and I talked to them in 97. So it's a long obedience in the same direction. But one of the things that, as I continue to read Jesus and the Gospels, I get a sense of Jesus saying regularly, just like the difference between cold air and hot air in terms of the amount of moisture those different airs can hold. This dispensation, this world we're living in, marked between the first and the second comings of Jesus, can only hold so much. And I'm not quite sure how to categorize that which it can hold, but and because it can only hold so much, the presence of God in this world will have certain consequences. The cross itself is the consequence of that. And of course, the prologue to the Gospel of John talks about it, that when God comes into this world, it's the day of the Lord. That's what the day of the Lord is. It's the revelation of the presence of God in the world. And so it looks like the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. And so what you just sort of sketched out in terms of this relationship is vital. And it's not just now. It's not just modern secular civilization. It's all civilization. And
Mhm.
so in that sense, the evocative image of the New Jerusalem is, I think, in some ways a
Mm.
resolution of this tension.
Nice. Yeah. So can I say that back to you?
Yes, please do.
And this is for the purposes of making it a richer thing, because what you said was correct and good. And I'm just going to say it back to you in a different set of words so that more of it can land for more. So there's a kind of world, and I've just articulated two deeply distinct kinds of world. There's the indigenous world and there's a civilized world. And we can just put a line between them. There are different kinds of worlds, profoundly distinct in nature and how they operate.
And there are indigenous worlds and civilized worlds. It's not just one, but there is a oneness about them too. So keep going.
This is a point. There's something about the Bronze Age and the Roman era and Western civilization that are all participating in a kind, like a very big meta kind that is itself as a meta kind very, very fundamentally. The whole point is fundamentally, intrinsically distinct from a meta kind that attaches to the Iroquois and the Polynesians and the Shuar and the Aborigines. The Aborigines on the whole to the side because that's a very old lineage. They may be doing something even deeper than I can understand. Um, and in the world of the technological, we've been able to identify these things that are called S curves in technical innovation, and these are like microkinds. Right, so there's a moment where you're doing what are they called, vacuum tubes, and that moment has an S curve, meaning that we don't know how to do them yet, and we're not very good at it, but we're getting better at it. Oh, we're really good at it. Now we're using them a lot. Yeah, but we've kind of done the best we can with them, and now they're starting to get a little bit played out. And what happens, of course, is then transistors come. So we get these nested S curves. And as it turns out, you can use that same model to look at what's been happening in the arc of civilization, that there's something that happened in the civilization nature of the Roman world that reached an S curve. And when it collapses, it doesn't collapse back into the Roman world. It collapses up into this new S curve, right? That has the process of the dark ages at the bottom. And then we got pretty good at it. And then we're all right. But what's interesting about this is that if you actually, this is a very practical, this is empirical, what I'm saying. If you do the analysis of these S curves, the duration of each S curve, the space between them gets shorter.
Hmm.
This is the accelerating change dynamic that's been noticed by many people from a lot of different backgrounds. It's not just Kurzweil. He's like the least relevant of people who've looked at this. And a number of different people who have looked at it have said, hey, wow, this is weird. It kind of looks like we're actually reaching something where the meta S curve of, let's say, civilization is reaching a point where it's the big picture, right? So we've got all these nested S curves of civilizations that we can talk about, and we can actually begin to organize them on a timeline of how they relate to each other. And when we do that, we begin to notice, huh, it seems like we're actually are coming to the end of this big S curve that's been going on since Sumeria and is coming to a head kind of right now, like in the next 2 decades or so, which is super relevant. Like that's a short time for the end of all things.
Yes.
um, but your point, right? Your point is this is the day of the Lord. Right? The day of the Lord is in fact at hand. And I'm saying this now in a completely different way, and yet it's profoundly correlate. Um, we are coming to the end of something where we can begin to notice that it has endness. Like we froze. What was the last thing you heard?
It stopped. We are coming to the end of something.
End. So we could just set up and go with that and say that's that. We're done.
We just
Or we
end the
could
video
continue.
right there.
No, sorry. So we're coming to the end of something. And it's the kind of thing where you can diagnose the fact that it has an end as part of its nature
Yes.
and where we are. Right. So it's not that different than a doctor speaking to an 87-year-old man who's in failing health saying, hey, you're coming to the end of something.
Yeah.
This is how it works.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're coming to the end of something. And the thing that we're coming to an end of is much bigger than anything that we have ever witnessed coming to the end of. Right. It's 10,000, 15,000 years in the making.
Yeah.
And that's like I can say that from a secular point of view entirely.
Yeah.
I don't need any eschatological sensibility behind that. And what we then notice is, hey, weird, these two things fit together. So there we are. The day of the Lord is coming. In fact, in
Yeah.
some sense, it's breaking through. Like all
Yes.
these things that are happening. You said COVID, even Hiroshima. These are like pieces of something popping through, and they're popping through more intensely and more clearly. Um, and it will be really nice. It will be really nice to have in the closet the we have been preparing for the day of the Lord. We have been
Yes.
living in a way that is deeply based on the most fundamental things, right? On the actual strong foundation, so that we can respond. That when the day of the Lord reveals itself
Right.
and indisputably, we step forward into that
Yes.
as opposed to pulling away.
Yes. And you can, in the day of the Lord that happened with the hurricane in the mountains, you can now look back and say, when that day of the Lord came, you look around the community and you know who stood up and who didn't. If there was somebody, a deep prepper who was in their bunker and, they're in there like, I always knew this day was happening and I'm keeping it shut and I'm just going to sit here and watch Seinfeld the whole time. Okay. Well, now we all know who you are. We're leaving open that while there's breath, there's chance for conversion. Um, one of the things that caught my eye this week on Twitter was you retweeted. I've never heard of Voodoo Six Von, um,
Oh,
about Tyson and Paul, because this to me was when I saw this thing being advertised on Netflix, and I thought, wow, again, it's sort of like we have a YouTuber who is not he's not a fighter, and so you have the institution of boxing. I mean, and again, all of this, how is boxing different from a street brawl?
mhm.
And so now we've got Mike Tyson, who is very much an iconic figure from professional boxing, and this other guy who in some ways completely epitomizes the transition that's happening within media, within all institutions. And of course, this happens about at the same time as Trump's reelection. And I'm just thinking, these are the revelations that are breaking through, and reality keeps coming, emerging and erupting and asking, can you see me yet? Can you see me yet? So
Yeah,
talk to me about why this, and I can pull up these set of tweets. I've got them here.
it's okay. I remember.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so Voodoo, by the way, just as background, Voodoo is a global war on terror. So he was on the ground shooting at people and being shot at. So he's the person who has experience in that. As it turns out, he's also a pretty profound historian, and so he has a deep sense of history across a variety of different disciplines, specifically mostly Western, not exclusively
I'll
Western.
put the link to the tweet in the notes so anybody watching can go back and look.
And he's an anon. I don't know how old he is. He's probably younger than me, but not. He's not a millennial. Maybe he is an old millennial. It's hard to say, but I feel like he's probably more like mid to late 40s is my guess. And I've spoken with him. I haven't spoken with him like this. I don't know what he looks like. All right, so that's the context. So he writes this thread, and I was chewing on what is going on with this fight, and what was the energy that was being called forth. I was like, I think he nailed it, because one of the parts of what's happening, this notion of the superficial, it maps to things like, do you know Baudrillard at all?
A little bit. I've learned Baudrillard from YouTube, so I don't want to lean too much into it.
Kind of perfect, by the way. But it maps to this notion of Baudrillard's levels. So Baudrillard is the basic at the center is in fact reality. Like that's reality. And then you move these layers of simulation to simulacra. Another word that Eric Weinstein, I think, popularized, kayfabe,
Yep.
which is professional wrestling, where there's this really interesting thing where you're playing with is it real or not? And the fact that it's not real, but we're all kind of conspiring with each other to pretend like it's real, but kind of also conspiring with each other to confuse each other about whether or not it's real. Like it's literally designed to obfuscate the distinction between the simulation and the real. So this is really far out there. And what Voodoo is saying is from the point of view of somebody for whom death is a lived reality. And what he's saying is this is how you actually execute the ritual of lineage, meaning that what could and should have happened is that Paul and Tyson should have met in a deeply committed effort to knock the other one out completely, which penetrates past. It's a day of the Lord, like it's an actual rubber hits the road. It's David Goliath. It's the energy of kill or be killed, 1 or 0, life or death, like these sacramental moments. It's a sacramental moment that is found in combat. Combat has this reality to it.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that we discovered. Oh, by the way, it's one of the reasons why cultural renovation is often found in the military and the monastery, because these are places where our ability to bullshit are finally they reach their end, they reach their nadir. And when we're actually fighting for our lives, either we get our shit together and win, or our adversary gets their shit together and wins, and one of us is just gone from the earth entirely. So he's invoking that and saying, imagine a world where what happened was the fight went down, and one of two things happened. Either Tyson actually defeats this guy, or Paul defeats Tyson and deals with the consequences of doing that, by the way,
Right.
which are not trivial.
Right.
That's a different world.
Right.
And this is what he was pointing out. That's a different world. And that's a proper world in a very particular sense, because what happened instead is that Paul continued, and we're still living in the aftermath. The Jaguar ad also came out, right? We're not through with this shit yet, but
Yep.
Paul continued the legacy of parasitism, right? The legacy of
Mm.
attaching to the vital traditions, the things that are alive, livingness, and extracting from them, in this case, just money at the end of the day, money and
Yeah.
attention, extracting salience, right?
Yeah.
So trading salience for relevance, to use Johnny V's terms, or trading, how would you say it? Extracting life parasitically is the very nature of the simulacrum. And the restoration of reality requires doing something that grounds that in things in reality that cannot be simulated. And that's the idea, right? If Tyson, let's say I'm fighting Paul, Paul would beat me up, so it's not very useful. But imagine that I was like a capable fighter. If I'm fighting him and it's actually a, a match that is grounded in will and skill and health and power in a way that is profoundly more fundamental than human, then something real has actually occurred. Right? And that fact of reality is the resyncing, right? That's the checksum that brings people back into a location. And even if the transition is one where Tyson has lost and Paul has won, Paul has done something real. And to have done something real is a revelation for people of his world. They don't even know that something real is possible. So that was, I think, the energy that I was receiving when I was listening to or perceiving that tweet.
I think that's yes. And I think part of the reason, it's not incidental that it was on Netflix. It's not incidental that it comes at the same time as the election. And now when I look at much is made now of the first move of Trump's new presidency is the selection of the cabinet. And you see RFK Jr. and his Make
Make
America,
America
help me
health
again,
again. Yeah.
Maha. And you see Dr. Oz, and you see McMahon's, is that his ex-wife? I mean, he certainly isn't still married
No
to,
idea. Yeah.
um, and
Spouse of some sort. Yes.
spouse of some sort, the Secretary of Education. And you begin to look at this, and of course, I mean, what civilization is horrified, and and you were the one that came up with Blue Church. So let's say Blue Church is horrified because in some ways this is so hard. In some ways, ultimately, idolatry is the confusion of our thing with the thing itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the day of the Lord comes to the Blue Church. And so the little scrap of something I put out this morning was when I was listening to The Rest is History's treatment of 1968, because 1968 that was very much a day of the Lord year, where LBJ, who, it's so interesting if we would compare sort of a composite of John F. Kennedy and LBJ, who were very much like this with each other, couldn't stand each other. In some ways, Donald Trump is a combination of John F. Kennedy and LBJ. But what has changed is the iteration of kayfabe around them. I mean, LBJ would, take out his Johnson and that he called Jumbo, and, and show it to his friends and enemies to make a point, something sort of right out of the Roman Emperor days. John F. Kennedy was urbane and articulate and a Harvard man, and, all of these things. And he married you know, a woman who would have a fascination for the Greeks. And of course, LBJ would give people the Johnson treatment when he was 6'3" and heavy set, and he was a Southerner, and he'd get up into someone, and you know how it is when somebody, certain kind of man, puts his arm around you and pulls you in tight and makes his point, and you begin to realize, well, this isn't exactly a rape, but
You begin to realize you fucking killed Kennedy, didn't you, dude?
So
Jason, yeah.
but so we've seen this transition. I mean, one of the big transitions that has come has in fact been, okay, we're not going to have Walter Cronkite. We're not going to not say the words. The reporters aren't going to mention that John F. Kennedy is a sexual predator in many ways, and he's also a drug addict, but he's still on the 50 cent piece. Um, and LBJ, on one hand, was a fighter for civil rights from Texas politics, which, no one could sort of figure out how that would work, and, sort of lost the South for the Democratic Party, and wasn't terribly faithful to Lady Bird, but still in many ways loved her dearly. And then because he had enough something so that when Vietnam went horribly wrong, he could not bear this man who had was probably in some ways one of the most skilled politicians of the 20th century because he had mastered the Senate. He couldn't tolerate being president anymore. And he certainly probably would have walked away into it. But of course, Richard Nixon, a man who was faithful to his wife, a man who was a Quaker, and if there's something that really has deep resonance with Blue Church, it's Quakerism in many ways.
Mm.
Um, and so now we're at this turning from the K. We wouldn't look at Walter Cronkite and say kayfabe, but
No.
now we sort of have to.
But when we look at, say, Rachel Maddow or what's the guy's name from Fox? Shoot, I can't remember. It doesn't matter. We definitely do,
Yes.
right? We are certain that all people who are the Walter Cronkite derivatives are full of it. Right? We're
Yes.
certain. There's not even a question. It's absolute certainty. In fact, they've stipulated as much in lawsuits. we're entertainers. We're not journalists. Okay, great. Yeah. So what happens is you have a situation where, with Reagan, for example,
Yes.
you begin to notice that looking presidential has this weird way of landing more fundamentally than being presidential by
Yes.
hypothesis. Um, this continues to accelerate. We see get somebody like Obama, where he's able to do the presidential thing at extremely high level, right? He
Yes.
looks and sounds just like you'd want him, like central casting, perfect.
Yeah.
And if the way you perceive reality, or even if what you value is the narrative, right? If you value good cinema, and if you value beautiful writing, then you love Obama, right? He really gives you exactly what you're looking for. And you hate Trump. This
Yeah.
is one of the things that's going on with TDS is that Trump is the absolutely not that. But he's not virtue, and he's not virtue signaling, but he's definitely not virtue signaling, right? The one thing is definitely not as virtue signaling. Nobody can be confused to think that he is doing something to convey to you that he is virtuous in any legible way, right? None of that. Which has
Except he still goes to court to try to fight. I mean, what do you do with Stormy Daniels? Because if he didn't sleep with her, then we're let down. If he admits he slept with her, then we're let down. And this is where we're at.
oh man, this is where that KFAB thing becomes so confusingly potent, right?
Yes.
Because it's like it vibrates. It starts to vibrate at a higher and higher level. Like even the notion of somebody was doing the versions of Hulk Hogan. We have like these variations where Hulk Hogan is like going into a deeper and deeper rabbit hole of intensity around what the heck is going on. And then of course McMahon, weird to be doing it through the WWF, but I guess that's the point. The fact that the McMahon's, who knows what his spouse's relationship is now officially in the government, or if she gets approved or whatever, confirmed. When McMahon becomes part of the story, right? He steps through the membrane instead of being the owner. He's now participating. The Trump teleports out from the real world into this environment, and everything gets very very bottled up. It's a lot like did you see Jim Carrey's Man in the Moon?
Yes, a while ago. So it's not,
I
I'll
I
probably
can't
have to rewatch it.
I can't remember the name of the comedian, and if I could, it'd be a little bit
Andy
easier. But
Kaufman.
Andy Kaufman, exactly. So we've got this situation where Andy Kaufman makes existential commitment to pretending to be somebody else. Right?
Yeah.
So deep that he's driving his own family insane. He's going to jail, like he's just living. So then Jim Carrey plays Andy Kaufman doing that and commits to the bit so much that he loses his. All right, so it's that kind of thing. It's like we're playing with this distinction between reality and our imagination and the way that those things can get deeply, deeply, deeply entangled. And that's different. That's a different kind of thing. It's actually proximal. It's closer to reality. The world of Trump is closer to reality than the world of Obama
Yes.
because it's palpably incapable of being perceived as salient there's something going on, right? It just drives you nuts. And the fact that, the cabinet positions are this wild, like, and the way Elon Musk, shows up in this fashion where on the one hand, he can make rockets that do things that are amazing. And on the other hand, he apparently is somehow playing Diablo at the top level in the world with his left hand while he's tweeting, right? So there's something going on here which doesn't make sense. It actually shatters our ability to try to glue reality together in a nice narrative that we can put together. And maybe that's kind of the point. Maybe kind of the point is that this, again, something is happening. The advent of the sacred, right? Something is
Yes,
happening.
it is the
Much
advent of the
more.
sacred.
Yeah, much more the individuals involved. And the fact that none of it makes sense is the point.
Yes. And the fact that, so, you know, we, I think you've just so well articulated what I've been just kind of, of course that gets vomited out onto my video stream with these crazy things that I just can't take it anymore. So I turn on the camera and I yell at the internet. Um, but I can't explain this to dear family and friends
Mm-hmm.
because this is going out on the internet and some of them will watch it, but some of them will just be like, yeah, he's a little crazy. And I had this, when I started talking about Jordan Peterson with, the Blue Church part of the Christian Reformed Church, when I started talking about Jordan Peterson, and a whole bunch of people are just like, I remember when a story my father told me. My grandfather was also a Christian Reformed minister, in the first part of the 20th century, and very conservative. The Christian Church, very conservative, taking churches in these different places. And then my father is a Christian Reformed minister, and my father taking this church in Paterson, New Jersey, in the 60s and 70s on the front lines of the civil rights movement, of the heroin epidemic. I mean, doing all of these things. And so my father sitting at the Christian Reformed Synod, and somebody coming up to him and saying, "You're Stan, I don't know what happened to you. Your father was such a good conservative."
Mm-hmm.
And part of what's happened to me, I'm sure, is that there are many people in the Christian Reformed Church that would like to knock on the virtual door of my YouTube channel and say, "Paul, I don't know what happened to you. Your father was such a good progressive." And so I'm watching this happen in the world, and all I can think of, and I want to really be careful with this because I don't mean it how it's going to be heard, but I can't find any other words than Jesus in that if you can see what's happening with Tyson and Paul to a certain degree, again, and please, everybody listen to this, don't hear it in the way that you're going to hear it and freak out about it. You must be born from above. I mean, because I can't sit down and explain to you why almost everything that you say about Trump is correct and also wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that for you, which in a way is sort of the end of Protestantism. Because Protestantism is partly, if I can sit down in a room and teach it to you from the Bible, you can have it. But that's only part of Protestantism, because another part of Protestantism, especially the Calvinism that my tradition comes from, on one hand, performatively says, I'll get you all in a church and I'll put you in a row and I'll tell it to you straight and you'll all get it. And then we'll all be Christians together. And once we do this, we'll move to the new world and we'll build the heavenly Jerusalem. And New Haven, Connecticut is the city four square. Yet at the same time, the Calvinists say it's absolutely the most unpredictable, apocalyptic thing that you cannot make any footnotes to, where someone turns from darkness to light.
Mm-hmm.
And on one hand, it's completely recognizable. We can see the fruits of the Spirit. We can bear witness to the power of Christ in them. But at the same time, I was writing when you were talking about the hand of God was more visible when the day of the Lord came to your town. But the hand of God always seems to maintain plausible deniability in this dispensation. And so on one hand, it's the end of Protestantism in terms of the hope that we can sit people down in the room and we can tell it straight and they'll get it. In other words, we can change hearts. Another piece of Protestantism was always that human beings do not have the key to the human heart itself, and God reserves the code. And so, on one hand, he will change people that we think they're not really a Christian, but in the day of revelation, they then appear, they appear standing in the heavenly host. But yet others that we imagine, well, they were certainly a Christian, depart from me, I never knew you. I mean, it's all of this apocalyptic stuff just kind of comes together where, on one hand, it's all about the preaching of the word and the explaining. We live in a Protestant era. On the other hand, this is the kind of thing that no one can provoke in you except God alone, which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially what the Calvinist doctrine of election means. That, hey, run your Christian schools, run your services, do all of your spiritual formation, do your fasting, do your feasting and your fasting. I mean, do the whole shtick. But finally, God alone has the key to reality, and he turns it when and where and how only he decides, and we are sort of left feeling our smallness and our impotence, and yet sometimes at his dispensation the joy of participation when he somehow turns on Jordan Hall's light to say, oh, this is wholesome here. Maybe we'll stay here for a while. Maybe we'll listen to these people, and then God shows up, and it's, I can walk my world in 15 minutes, and we have no light, power, water, internet, but part of me is somehow thrilled to have met the Lord in a way that I both am going to really try to get away from once we can have power and lights and water, but in another way that I will never forget, and I will
Mm.
participate in a community that doesn't feel like this world can actually maintain for very long until we go back into the lack of intimacy. And of course, that scales into marriages because marriages have these moments of just absolute intense intimacy and oneness, and then years of the
Mm.
mundane where, you know, we're sharing a house and we have kids and we watch TV at night. And are you going to pick up the groceries? I'm going to go and, help the neighbor with the thing. And
Mm-hmm. And
there's
by the
life.
way, in my experience at least, maybe this has to be my wife's particularities, but there's a point at which the mundanity has reached a point where she, as far as I can tell, cannot help but presence the day of the Lord in our relationship. Let's put it that way. Um,
Yes.
and that's neat, actually. That's really interesting to think about how that, all these different fractal levels.
Yeah.
But if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to go back to where you said the end of Protestantism, because what does that mean in terms of what comes?
Well, that's in some ways my big project. And so you've probably heard me say this before, but so the Orthodox are all about the liturgy, the liturgy, the liturgy. And right now, when you have a non-theist cognitive scientist from the University of Toronto giving a class behind the paywall in the symbolic world about ritual, the world has changed. So the liturgy, the liturgy, the liturgy, the ritual, the ritual, the ritual. Cognitive scientists are kind of like, oh my goodness, look, this liturgy ritual stuff. It just takes our breath away. And then the Catholics are the Eucharist, the Eucharist, the Eucharist, veneration of the Eucharist, adoration of the Eucharist. It's whatever happens to the Catholic Church, the Pope can have an affair, the bishops can be molesting children. A pope can eagerly hope that fascism will save their world, and it doesn't. But yet we've got the Eucharist. And they're right. The Orthodox are right. They've got the liturgy. And the Catholics are right. They've got the Eucharist. But the Orthodox have Eucharist and Catholics have liturgy. And then the Protestants come along and say, the preaching of the word, the preaching of the word, the preaching of the word. And they're right. And the Orthodox have the word, and the Catholics have the word, and the Protestants, they have the word. And so when I go to ARC last year, and it's this massive hall, and at every, I could think of, I kept thinking of all of evangelistic um these evangelistic meetings where you go to and every eye closed. You haven't been around these people long enough to know all of the rituals. Every eye closed, and and now suddenly the preacher is going to give the altar call, and there's going to be this movement, and people are going to come forward. And right now we can see people turning from death to life, and it's the apocalypse of the preaching of the word that happens in Protestantism. And of course that goes back to Jesus. Tens of thousands were fascinated to hear him speak. And so it's not that the Orthodox isn't church, and it's not that the Catholic isn't church, and it's not that the Protestant isn't church, but the printing press and the internet and we are just completely inundated with words to the point that they still are magic. They don't go away. We're in that S curve, but and so now it's, I think, the communion of the saints, which is, and so now every week I have estuary at church, and some people come just for estuary and then leave after. They don't want to stay for church. So the grand design to save living stones is failing. But at the same time, I sit in a room with 8 to 10 people, many of whom are deeply skeptical about professing Jesus Christ as Lord, or that church is, they don't have any idea what church is, but yet something is happening in the communion of the saints. And that is revealed. There were, every time we had over a foot of snow in Paterson, New Jersey, we had a tiny mini apocalypse. And I remember that as a boy, because Paterson is this gritty, just outside of New York. Lou Costello comes from there. All kinds of strange things. And when New York had its Renaissance under Giuliani, the Renaissance didn't make it to Paterson, because you needed a place for all the people who could no longer afford to live in New York to go. But every time you get more than a foot of snow, well, the streets were kind of made before cars, and so there's cars all over the place, and so a foot of snow in Paterson just sort of stops the city, and maybe the power will go out, and so then suddenly everybody winds up on the street with shovels, and you shovel your neighbor's walk, and you shovel your neighbor's car out, and they've got all kinds of hills, and so someone's stuck. And so people who most of the week don't even look at each other are now somehow, snow becomes a sacrament in the street of Paterson. It'd be so funny, because when we get a big snowstorm, my father, who enjoyed photography, would go out with his camera and shoot pictures of these streets in Paterson that were eerily quiet because everyone's huddled in their home. And then when COVID came through, we shot pictures of places in the world that normally would be filled with traffic, and it looks like an apocalyptic movie, because we're staying in for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And so there is an end to Protestantism, but it's also the case that, and this is a point that I've made, that I'm sorry to irritate certain of my Orthodox and Catholic friends. You cannot be a Christian in America and not be a Protestant. It is that infection, like the zombie virus in The Walking Dead, that performatively, if you're Orthodox in America, you're going to be performatively Protestant.
Mm.
and many Catholics have come to terms with this already. And but now, the Orthodox are, no, we're gonna, if we get back to the Latin Mass, oh, okay. If we get back to, we really do the liturgy, oh, okay. But now you're right, this S curve has accelerated, and part of what's coming down are the walls between our tribes. But just like everything else with these disruptions, they don't really go away. Print newspapers haven't gone away, magazines haven't gone away, radio hasn't gone away. These things don't actually go away, but they're also not what they were. And
Hmm.
so we're in a place right now where the church is going to come into something we know not what. And it's going to be day of the Lord-ish, but again, some days of the Lord are acute.
Hmm.
From one day to the next, you knew your world has changed. Some days of the Lord are long, and and they don't hit evenly. So you can find pockets of orthodoxy and hidden places of the world where they're not quite completely disrupted. But any place that, again, this is what this conversation I'd had with John Heers was talking about. We both had experience with Haitians and Haiti, where, when John Heers was in Haiti and then he was in West Africa still wasn't like Haiti. Haiti was too close. But then the smartphones and the internet came to West Africa. And so that world is going away.
Hmm.
But West Africa doesn't really go away, but it's and we've seen this in the church countless times. Of course, the missionaries go to Africa and they start all these mission churches, but then it's the end of colonialism, and so the what was sort of the Anglican church kind of has to leave Africa, but other churches take it and they're not Anglican, and now you have an indigenous African church, but you also still have Anglicans, and those Anglicans meet in Sacramento, and I hear them when we're done with church and they're singing praise and worship songs from the 80s and Anglican hymns from the 19th century and African songs that I never heard of before, and every now and then a country music song. And they're all Nigerian immigrants. And I just watch and think, the Lord is at work.
Something's up.
Yeah. And so I don't know what happens after Protestantism because we haven't been there yet.
Beautiful.
But the day of the Lord is coming to, the evangelical churches and Protestant churches in the nuns, but um it isn't just perennialism. No, that's
No,
perennialism
definitely not.
isn't right because it's not instantiated. And so, as I've been following your story, for we always, because we can't see the spirits, because we can't see the wind, but we see the trees blowing. I mean, you've been a leaf on the tree. Your story is a leaf on the tree. And so when I get a message from someone on Twitter, have you heard, is Jordan Hall okay? Because, oh, the hurricane hit his town.
Mhm.
Now, there's a leaf on the tree. And hmm. And so much of navigating the new S curve is trying to figure out what to watch. And so that
Hmm.
when you watch, so I watched the fight between Tyson and Paul, and I'm watching it and I'm thinking, yeah, first I saw, because you have the ritual of the weighing. And of course, the ritual of the weighing, the kayfabe is, Tyson, he slaps him. And, I'm going to kill you. And this is personal. And this is different. And,
Yes, yes.
yeah, 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 yeah. I know it. That's the ritual. That's what we do. It's, the body of Christ given for you. And someone will say, oh, how can you? No, I'm not saying they're on the same level, but this is the ritual. And but then, okay, so I think, well, I saw your tweet. I thought, oh, this is exactly right, because are we going to see reality, or are we going to see
Oh,
LBJ and Ladybird stand next to each other as a loving family?
and I got a call. I got
Oh,
it. 2 hours has passed, brother.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Holy
man.
cow. Yeah, I got to jump on it. But
All right.
we've got a lot more to talk about, so maybe we should do this again
All
sometime not
right.
too
Just
long.
hit the link again.
Will do. All right,
All
brother.
right.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.